The alarm bells have sounded again in Kyiv, and this time it's not exclusively because of the threat of new Russian attacks. What is ringing on this occasion is the alarm of the national treasury. Because, VisualPolitik viewers, the Ukrainian government has practically empty coffers. It is running out of money, which may not only have significant economic, but also military consequences. What we're going to talk about in this video is something like the other aspects of the war front. An indispensable side, but one that, nevertheless, receives hardly any media coverage. Ukraine is not only fighting against Russia, it is also dealing with a huge economic, monetary, and energy crisis, the repercussions of which could be enormous. But to what extent is Ukraine at risk of going bankrupt? What exactly is the damage that the Russian invasion has caused? Who is really funding the war effort? And perhaps the most important question of all, what might this mean on the battlefield? Listen up. Things on the battlefield have improved considerably for Ukraine. 6 months after the invasion began, the Russians are virtually at a standstill. Now, their only advantage is limited in practice to their powerful artillery, which continues to inflict terrible damage on the Ukrainian army and cities. The disproportion between Russian and Ukrainian artillery on the front lines remains enormous. And in this respect, Russia's strategy is very clear: to use its enormous artillery muscle to wipe out everything in its path and facilitate the advance of the infantry. They've done this before. However, despite this, against all odds, the advances of Putin's army have come to an almost complete halt. The stubborn resistance of the Ukrainians and the arrival of Western weaponry has given the Ukrainian army much more muscle, and it shows.
Ukrainian attacks in Crimea weaken Russia's military capacity.
But all this relates to the military front. In this video, what we want to focus our attention on is another battlefield, what could be called the economic front. The war launched by Russia has had devastating consequences on the ground and also on the Ukrainian economy. Many factories have been destroyed, infrastructure is being badly hit, and many companies have been forced to close. For example, according to several surveys, the war has wiped out about half of all of the jobs in the country, either because they have disappeared or because wages and hours worked have plummeted. With data from June 2022, and despite the military mobilization, the unemployment rate already exceeds 35%. Take a look at this map, for example. During the summer of 2022, slightly more than 20% of the entire territory of Ukraine was occupied by Russia, or turned into a bloody battlefield. These are the regions you see in dark blue. Well, before the war, this territory accounted for almost 20% of the country's GDP, and about 28% of its entire population lived there. And that's just the beginning, because obviously there are more or less affected areas, but Russia has bombed and attacked infrastructure, factories, and cities all over the country. For example, Russian missiles have destroyed or severely damaged major oil refineries. Another example, some of the largest factories in the countries were located precisely in Mariupol, and today they are rubble. In total, it is estimated that the damage caused by Russia during the first 6 months of the war alone was close to $100 billion. A huge fortune for one of the poorest countries in Europe. And to top it all off, we have to add to this the enormous figure, tens and tens of billions that will be lost through the closure of factories and businesses, and all that it will cost to give the country back on its feet. Not to mention the loss of life and the mass exodus of refugees. The result of all this savage destruction? Basically, the collapse of Ukraine's currency, a huge hole in public accounts, skyrocketing inflation, and an economy in free fall. In fact, taking wages into account, Ukraine has once again become the poorest country in all of Europe. Now, to what extent does the crisis threaten Ukraine's future? What exactly is the level of economic destruction that the country is undergoing? What might this all mean for the war effort? Well, we're going to look at all of that right now.
The other aspect of the war.
Russia has invaded approximately 1/5 of Ukraine. However, in one way or another, the war affects the entire country. Do you want a concrete example? Well, according to a survey conducted in early August 2020, 54% of Ukrainians have loved ones, family, or friends fighting against the invader. And make no mistake, resistance against Russia has become a source of national pride and cohesion. However, wars are not only painful and destructive, they are also terribly expensive. Maintaining combat operations is not cheap at all, especially when the fighting directly affects the economic fabric of the country. Take note, because according to the Ukrainian authorities, the GDP will plummet by more than 33% in 2022. A figure that the World Bank, for example, raises to a dramatic 45%. And the picture could get even worse. For instance, practically all investment projects are at a standstill, and then Ukraine's main banks are facing default rates close to 30%. A situation that, if sustained over time, could put them on the ropes. In other words, it could lead them directly to bankruptcy. And obviously, when an economy collapses in such a way, public revenues do exactly the same. In Ukraine, in real terms, during the month of June, the government's tax collection has plummeted by almost 50% compared to the previous year. But the war has to be financed. So at the same time that revenues have been cut in half, public spending is estimated to have increased by more than 60%. The result? A huge and savage gap in the public accounts. You see, despite having cut everything that is not essential at the moment, the Ukrainian government is barely managing to finance around 30% of all public spending with taxes. We are talking about a deficit here of around $5 billion every month, a huge amount for a country whose GDP in 2021 was barely $200 billion. In fact, if we take into account the slump in economic activity, the projected deficit by 2022 could easily exceed 40% of GDP. And the question is, how on earth can such a budget gap be financed? Keep in mind, we're not only talking about things like pensions, doctors' salaries, which in itself is a very important thing under the circumstances, but also military expenditure. In order to sustain the war, Ukraine needs to finance this gigantic deficit. The question is how to do it. And I know what you're thinking. Of course, issuing debt like everyone else. Well, yes, but at the same time, no. Think about it. Would you be willing to invest your money in buying the debt of a country on the verge of bankruptcy, with 20% of its territory invaded, and which is also at war with Russia? Well, I hate to say it, but exactly. So in addition to issuing debt, Zelensky's government has had to resort to other measures. For example, the central bank has been printing money like crazy to finance the government. The problem in that is, in addition to triggering inflation, it's putting downward pressure on the value of the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency. This in turn is forcing the central bank to consume its foreign exchange reserves so that the local currency does not collapse completely. Specifically, during the summer of 2022, the Ukrainian central bank has been churning out an average, hold on to your chair here, of $1 billion each week in foreign currencies. At this rate, in a few months, the country could be left without a single dollar. That is why it is so important for Ukraine to reopen foreign trade channels, including, of course, the sale of grain. I'm sure you've heard about it in the media. Of course, at best, this activity would barely generate $1 billion a month, an amount too small to compensate for the leakage the country currently has. And that's how we get to news like this.
21st of July 2022, Ukraine devalues hryvnia currency by 25% against US dollar.
At the end of July, Ukraine decided to devalue its currency by 25% in an attempt to stabilize its currency by making exports cheaper and imports more expensive, and thus reduce the outflow of dollars from the country. But of course, this is nothing more than a stopgap. The central bank can neither continue to massively finance the government, nor can the country continue to burn its dollars. And of course, the Ukrainians are well aware of these facts. The situation is so delicate that the government itself has asked the country's public enterprises to delay the payment of their debt even when they have the money to do so. The objective is to stop the outflow of dollars at any cost. This has also been done by the government itself, which has agreed with its main creditors to delay all payments on Ukraine's public debt by 1 year. And as if that were not enough, there's still more. Another problem facing this country is that winter is coming. Ukraine currently has the lowest level of gas storage in all of Europe, for obvious reasons. For example, it's estimated that at the end of July, it had barely 22% of its storage capacity full, a totally insufficient amount to face the Ukrainian winter, an extremely cold one. Well, the calculations of the National Gas Company indicate that the country will have to buy at least 5 billion cubic meters of gas. At current gas prices in Europe, this could cost more than $10 billion. And no, that's not the end of their energy woes either. Ukraine will also have to spend significant resources to keep the power grid, which has been badly damaged by the Russians, running, both in terms of the power plants and the cables and the transformer stations themselves, which of course will further add to the bill. But naturally, a country simply cannot function without energy. So you see, whatever way you look at it, the economic situation in Ukraine is critical, even if some things have improved compared to the initial days of the invasion. Yes, most of the country's companies have reopened their doors. The supply of gasoline, diesel, and other fuels is being restored, as is more than 300 trucks which cross the border from Europe every day. The country has also begun selling electricity to the European Union. The elimination of tariffs and various regulatory requirements by allied countries is helping to revive exports, and in addition, the resistance of the army has meant that the bulk of their harvests could be carried out. But despite all this, the collapse of GDP, the closure of large factories, the glowing trade deficit, and above all, the gigantic gap in the public accounts make the situation critical. So then, we have to go back to the key question we were asking before. How on earth does Ukraine expect to pay all its bills? Well, do you know what? This is exactly where its Western allies come in. Check this out.
The survival of Ukraine.
So far, the Ukrainian government has taken a lot of measures against the clock to try and stabilize the situation. For example, it introduced severe capital controls, it intervened on the exchange rate, it slashed a lot of expenses, it guaranteed bank deposits, it eliminates and changed some taxes, interest rates were raised, and so on and so forth. However, As we have seen, the situation is so complicated that Ukraine itself has little it can do, and this is exactly where the international community comes in. You see, VisualPolitik viewers, it is not enough for the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and other allies to deliver military equipment to Ukraine. If they want this country to succeed in its fierce resistance against Russia, they also have to deal with the other side of the war. And do you know what? That's exactly, at least for now, what they are doing. Take a look at this graph. The Ukrainian government covers roughly just under 1/3 of all its public spending with taxes. It gets a similar amount by tapping the central bank, and then allies put up the rest. The aid has already become the main source of financing the public deficit by far. In the coming months, the aid is expected to increase so that Kyiv can stop printing money. In total, between the 24th of February 2022, which was the day the invasion began, and the beginning of August, the Ukrainian government has received more than $12 billion from the United States, the European Union, Germany, Japan, Canada, and other allies. $12 billion in the form of grants, donations, and loans on very, very advantageous terms to finance the Zelensky government's public spending. And not only that, these same allies have committed to disperse another $20 billion over the next few months just to support the government's finances. And take note, because if we add humanitarian aid and total military aid to this amount, the figure that the allies have committed to reimburse far exceeds $80 billion. As you can see in this graph, the largest amount by far corresponds to the United States. This is a lot, a serious amount of money. We're talking about a historic mobilization of resources to try and make the aggressor, in this case Russia, pay for the consequences of its actions on the battlefield. After all, it is not only Ukraine that is at stake. At stake in this war is the ability of free countries to defend themselves from the blackmail of a tyranny like Vladimir Putin's.
Ukraine's fight is our fight. Morten Bodskov, Danish Minister of Defense.
However, I am sorry to say, but this is not enough either. The war in Ukraine is not likely to end anytime soon. If the Western democracies really want Ukraine to succeed in fending off the aggression of Putin's troops, they will have to make a much greater effort. They have to commit more military, technical, and financial resources, and above all, they have to speed up disbursements. This is to say, they have to release the money faster, and they have to do it with the guarantee that the money will get to where it needs to go. We have already told you that Ukraine has never been known for having a first-class rule of law or for being the most transparent country in the world. But one way or another, the money has to come, and it has to come faster. Basically, because the economic situation in Ukraine is absolutely critical. And this, my friends, is the other side of the war. The other front of the battle in which a lot of work is being done, even though it rarely appears on TV. Of course, headlines like this one seem to indicate otherwise.
Europe's powers give Ukraine no new military pledges in July, data shows. Europe's military support for Ukraine has been decreasing since April, according to data from the Kiel Institute.
Let's see. The commitment of the United States, the United Kingdom, and most Eastern European countries seems firm. However, it is not clear that the same can be said of countries such as France or Germany. The energy crisis is beginning to punish them, and the feeling is that these countries would be delighted with the signing of a ceasefire, if only to continue receiving gas from Russia while they continue to look for alternatives. However, that could be a big mistake. The White House itself is very clear that much more is at stake in this war than Ukrainian sovereignty over the Donbass or the south of the country. At stake, above all, is the supremacy of the free world, and also at stake is what other dictators like Xi Jinping can learn about what never to do, for example, in Taiwan. In addition, Russia has occupied or holds under siege not only many of the main industrial areas, but also a very significant part of the country's natural resources, which could make the reconstruction of Ukraine very difficult. Some estimates suggest that Russia could have taken over 60% of the country's coal deposits, 42% of the country's metal deposits, and 1/3 of all rare earth deposits, and other critical minerals such as lithium. And that's without considering what the future of Ukraine would really be if Russia is not clearly defeated.
Ukraine would not only have lost much of its territory and resources, but would be constantly vulnerable to another Russian attack. No one in their right mind, or a private company, would invest in the rest of Ukraine if this turned into a frozen conflict. Jacob Kirkegaard, a fellow at the Washington-based Peterson Institute for International Economics.
And keep in mind that so far we have only talked about what Ukraine needs to stay on its feet, fighting the Russians. But the truth is that in the medium and the long term, the country will need much more money. We are talking about, according to varying estimates, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to get the Ukrainian economy, industry, cities, and infrastructure back on its feet. The war is devastating. Yes, all this might seem like a lot of money, and it certainly is. However, we have to bear in mind that the cumulative GDP of the Allied countries exceeds $50 trillion. In other words, they have more than enough muscle to shoulder the whole bill. So I don't know, seen in this light, the price to pay in exchange for defeating Putin and showing the world that it is a better idea to be allies of free countries seems pretty acceptable to me. In any case, what is clear is that the war in Ukraine goes far beyond Ukraine. Ukraine is militarily and financially dependent on the West, and if it has managed to stop the Russian war machine, it is mainly due to its tenacious resistance, but also the commitment shown by its Western allies. But still, the situation is critical. More money is needed, and it is needed now. If this does not happen, the Ukrainian economy could collapse completely, which would make it practically impossible to maintain combat operations. With no production, no money, no supplies, and a galloping crisis, there is little they could do. And of course, if you want our opinion, on VisualPolitik, we are very clear. Ukraine must be supported at all costs. This is one of those historic moments in which the free world has to impose itself on tyrannies. But having reached that point, it's now over to you. To what extent do you think the Allies will fund the Ukraine war effort? How far does the commitment go? Do you think we will see a ceasefire anytime soon? Leave us your comments in the box below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. By the way, in a past video on this channel, we made a mistake. Specifically, it was in the video about the 3 gate myths of the Ukrainian war. In that video, we mistakenly said that President Viktor Yanukovych awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine to Stepan Bandera. In reality, this title was awarded by Viktor Yushchenko and subsequently withdrawn by an administrative court in Donetsk, a ruling that was also upheld by the High Administrative Court of Ukraine. We really regret that error and we apologize for it. Thank you so much for being there with all of us here on VisualPolitik. All the best, and I'll see you next time.